Welcome, everyone. We are here. I'm Massimo Frigo, Senior Legal Advisor with the International Commission of Jurists. Welcome here in this broadcast in which we have started after some months of pause. And this time we're going to talk about something different. This time we are going to talk about the rule of law in the European Union. As you may know, the European Commission issued a report on the state of the rule of law in the European Union. And today, I'm very happy to be joined by Roisin Pillay here with me, the director of the ICJ Europe and Central Asia program. That's actually has been assessing the report and can explain us a bit more what this is and why this is important for us. I need to have a short disclaimer. Of course, Roisin we work together in this ICJ and in the same program. So I may be biased in the interview, but you can actually add questions. You can ask questions in the comments and we are going to address them. So if you think I'm not asking the right things, please act and intervene and ask yourself. Welcome, Roisin. How are you?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm great. Thanks. It's good to be finally on one of these broadcasts.
It's great. Let's hope we're going to have some questions. And I will just kick in a sense, very informally. So we have been hearing about this report on the rule of law. There's been a presentation, quite pompous, about how important it is. But what really is this report? In a sense, what does it say and what it contains?
Well, it's something new. It's really, I think, a step forward. That's the first time that we have the EU, the European Commission, publishing a really quite a rigorous assessment of the state of the rule of law in all of the EU member states. And it's a new departure. It's intended to be an annual report where all of the EU member states will be assessed against the standards that you have in the treaty and against the EU principles of rule of law. And it's important, I think, that it's a first step, but it starts, I think, it's one step in holding states to account against these standards and values. It's important because you actually don't have a lot of scrutiny. You don't have a lot of mechanisms and systems to ensure accountability and rule of law. Actually, a little bit less than you have, in terms of the international human rights law framework, but purely on rule of law, there's not so much. And of course, it's particularly important at the moment, and it's been put in place because of the really serious rule of law problems that we have in a number of member states now, and the concern as well that I think we've taken for granted that rule of law is protected in the EU. We think it's something that we've always enjoyed historically, and I think we've rested a little bit too much on the strong traditions of rule of law in the EU. But actually, if you look at any EU member state, probably you will find problems of rule of law, and that needs to be scrutinized. So I think it's a very valuable report in that way. It goes through, there's a general section of the report where they talk about the general trends and problems and common problems that can be identified. And then there's country reports for every single country according to a standard format, where they look at what rule of law means in concretely in realities. They look at the independence of the judiciary. We all know that that's an element of rule of law, the principle of legality. But they also look at things like media freedom, because that's key to preventing abuses of power as well. They look at anti-corruption frameworks. They look at how civil society space is protected. So these kind of issues that are also important human rights issues, these are treated for every country.
So that's really a massive endeavor to try to do it for all the member states, 28, soon 27 member states of the European Union. And actually, what's been the trigger to do that? Because this is actually going through a process. The rule of law is very important. for us, instance, in our work, we are the rule of law organization in the world. So we are the ICJ. But now, even for the European Union, this has become really a priority. So why do you think that the rule of law, that this report is a priority?
I mean, it's, of course, as I said, it's triggered by a common concern that, we can go backwards. So we're not on a trajectory of always making progress in our protection of human rights and rule of law. And we've seen things really going backwards in several member states. And we've seen really serious rule of law crises emerging in the last years in Hungary and in Poland, where there's been just a systematic dismantling, I would say, in both countries of the independence of the judiciary through all kinds of legislation, through political attacks on judges, through abusive disciplinary procedures, really a systematic undermining of one of the key constitutional protections against the arbitrary exercise of power, and a foundation of a democratic state. So you have these attacks in both of those countries. You have other elements as well of constraining of the space for civil society, for the media to operate. I mean, we've seen that probably particularly in Hungary, constraints on the capacity of civil society to protect human rights of some of the most marginalized group, like migrants, to provide advice and support to migrants, for example, or the constraints. We just saw the court decision the other day about academic freedom and the freedom to establish universities. So all of these kind of constraints have been brought in, and it's extremely troubling. And I think that the report is a response to this. But the report, it doesn't, and this is perhaps a controversial point about the report, it doesn't target just those countries that have the greatest problems. It's a universal report looking at these issues in all EU countries.
So actually, when there are certain countries, because we have been hearing of Poland and Hungary wanting to set up their own institute to assess the rule of law. When they say that there is a double standard, actually this report looks at all the countries.
Absolutely, and it's very rigorous in applying the same criteria to all the member states. I mean, and I must say, I think it does identify the problems that there are in Poland and Hungary and in other states too. It identifies those very well. I would say the weakness in it, though, is that it doesn't make recommendations on those. It doesn't target really enough. It perhaps doesn't differentiate enough the situation in those states that really have gone quite far down a road of undermining the rule of law. It doesn't make targeted recommendations in regard to those states. It doesn't, in fact, make recommendations in regard to any states. And it doesn't provide an obvious route for following up on its description of the situation with any kind of enforcement action. Now, obviously, there are other enforcement proceedings going on. There is the Article 7 process that has been triggered in regard to both Poland and Hungary, but that is progressing really slowly, given the seriousness of the situation in those countries.
If I may, the Article 7 has a vulnerability because, for those who don't know, the Article 7 process is a process of assessment, and when a member state does not respect the founding values of the EU, they may lose the right to vote. The problem is that at the end of the mechanism, it requires a unanimous vote of the European Council. It means, apart from the examined one, it means that all the member states of the European Union must agree. So as long as you have an ally that's going to veto, it's going to have blocking at the end of the road. So what you're saying is that, the problem is that it's a nice report, but it doesn't show its teeth. It says how states are going to take seriously this kind of assessment if they don't see that enforcement is in action. So what are your thoughts? Sorry, I interrupted you, but there were other procedures going on, no, you were saying?
Yeah. So there's the Article 7 proceedings that, as you say, have political constraints on them. But that, I hope that this report can be an impetus to push those proceedings forward. That certainly needs to be done. But I mean, there are also infringement proceedings that the Commission can initiate, and that they have done successfully, proceedings before the Court of Justice of the EU. That has been done quite successfully in relation to some of the issues in Poland, but that hasn't been done so in respect of others where you might expect those proceedings to have been initiated. For example, in relation to the recent emergency powers enacted in Hungary in relation to COVID, or ostensibly in relation to COVID. We didn't see infringement proceedings there, and there's other instances where perhaps those could be used. Those could be used more. So that's one aspect where there could be follow-up here. But I mean, in general, for this report, the report has been presented as Commission as very much about prevention, about just providing a kind of an assessment and an early warning, perhaps, of when there is backsliding on rule of law. But in the countries where you already have very serious erosion of rule of law, that isn't a particularly useful role to play. And I mean, to be critical, you could say that although the sections of this report on Poland and on Hungary are very good, they don't tell us anything we didn't know already. I mean, we know the depth of the problems in those countries. What we really need now is first follow up on enforcement action, and there are proposals to make this annual cycle, this annual mechanism of this report, to make it a bit more operational. I mean, the Parliament has made some proposals that are being debated now about how there can be follow-up, how there can be recommendations and follow-up by a mechanism for follow-up by the institutions, which I think would really give this, as you say, some teeth.
That would be, because the question is the following. The EU started dealing, sometimes we hear about some member states, in instance, we can cite Orban, we can cite Kaczynski, we can cite also other countries from Matteo Salvini. In instance, we hear politicians in member states saying, "Oh, but this is not the issue of the EU. The EU shouldn't deal with rule of law." But the reality is that the European Union has to deal with rule of law, because it has become really an existential issue. The European Union functioning is starting not to work anymore because of the rule of law. Because we have been hearing of cases of extraditions to Poland that currently are blocked because, let's face it, the Polish justice system currently cannot guarantee structural independence. What we call is the formal guarantees that allow, in a situation of pressure, the judiciary to remain independent. That's not there anymore, and that's why we have judges like Judge Pillay, that on 22nd of October will have to stand trial for just having published a judgment. So this has become really an existential issue, and as you say, there are discussions on what to do, but what's the discussion now in Parliament? So what could be the mechanisms with teeth that the EU could use?
I mean, there are different discussions. So one interesting discussion that's, apart from the legal remedies, an interesting discussion is also now happening about the conditionality of EU funds, which is something that, of course, could be a very important tool if the very significant EU funds that all governments and country authorities, national authorities receive, were made conditional on rule of law compliance. But this is, there's proposals in that respect now, but it's also, I think, politically proven quite difficult to get agreement on really strong, real protections of conditionality based on rule of law. But we'll need all of those. I think we'll need all of those tools, as you say, to preserve the standards of rule of law within the EU, that on which all of the EU systems really depend on on the ability to have mutual trust in the standards that apply in each EU member state. But it's also, I mean, more fundamentally about the values that the EU has enshrined in its own fundamental documents. You know, it's also about the protection of human rights. I mean, we know in the ICJ, I mean, one of our kind of cardinal values is that the EU is that the rule of law and human rights are inextricably intertwined. And we have, you know, the EU is also an organization of human rights. It has the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. All of these are, this is also fundamentally bound up in protection of rule of law. And one, I mean, a question that has been debated a lot as well, because of the very significant impact on human rights of the rule of law problems in several EU member states. One question has been, should this annual EU law report, this annual rule of law report also address wider questions of fundamental rights, of democracy, and because those are an issue here as well.
And should it? In a sense, that's actually the question: is should we have a wider exam of all the human rights issues, or maybe it would be worth to have a rule of law assessment and the human rights assessment on the sides? Because the question is the issue of the approach. Is the rule of law is the platform on which we create and we ensure the protection of human rights more than human rights itself. So, what do you think on that?
I mean, personally, I can see value in both approaches. I actually think it's very interesting that there is a focus on the rule of law in this mechanism, or this new kind of annual report that will be done, because it's something that we don't often see reviewed at an international level. We have a lot of mechanisms for review of human rights at the UN level. We have the treaty body annual, or not annual, but cycles of review over periods of years. You know, in Council of Europe, there's mechanisms. So we have those reviews. Certainly, it would be good to have a review like that at an EU level as well. Of course, we already have the Agency of Fundamental Rights and so on, but something in cooperation with that agency could be very helpful. We very rarely see at an international level, though, very rarely see reviews on rule of law principles. And so I think this is a very interesting precedent in this way. It's actually something might be interesting to have outside of the EU as well. You know, maybe it can be a model for what happens at UN level or elsewhere. But I mean, certainly, I think one good thing about this first report is from the European Commission is that it takes quite a broad view of rule of law. So it addresses, as I said, some human rights questions, those, you know, closely tied to rule of law. There's space for it to go further, I think, and there is space, as people in the Parliament and elsewhere have proposed. There is space certainly for it to take on more human rights issues. But I still think it's valuable to have a particular focus on rule of law, because it's those systemic issues of how you protect against arbitrariness are sometimes a bit neglected, and you know, they're worth focusing on, because they're at the root of a lot of the human rights problems we see in those countries as well.
Absolutely, and that's actually big part of the reason of our work and why we are dedicated so much energy to all of this. I think we are at the end now, because we are reaching our time, our 20 minutes. I don't know if there is anything more you would like to add, Roisin?
No, I don't think so, really. We're going to, from ICJ's point of view, I mean, we've been kind of feeding into this process along with a lot of the other human rights NGOs working in Europe, and so we will be feeding information, but I think also trying to make sure that this report is going to happen next year or the year after, and I think we're going to try to make sure that it can be strengthened, that it can really be followed up on, and that there are, you know, it will start to also take some practical effect in the following years. Hopefully this year, but even more so in the following years.
Yeah, absolutely, in a sense. And just that we have one comment, not in substance, what I want to put it, because One of our followers has asked whether this exchange is going to be recorded and made available. Yes, actually, this exchange is going to remain on the Facebook page, and we're going to put also a link on our website, so you can also if you had a bad connection or something, you can rewatch our exchange and the exchange comments. We're going to try to address them. So thank you very much, Roisin, for having joined us for this chat. Thank you very much for everyone who has followed us and will follow us in the recording. If there is any information, since you want to know about the work of the ICJ on the rule of law, you can find it on our websites. You can find it on our Twitter accounts. So feel free really to follow us and to contact us. We are there, and we will continue to work and fight for the rule of law in Europe and elsewhere. And until the next time, please stay safe and have a very nice day. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.